This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. Rewilding the world is an important step in combating climate change. Recreating ecosystems and habitat can't happen soon enough. Fortunately, a lot of solutions are already available, including the Miyawaki method of using mini-forests to reforest the world. Mini-forest revolution, using the Miyawaki method to rapidly rewild the world, was released in June 2022 by Chelsea Green Publishing. Author Hannah Lewis shares the ins and outs of what the Miyawaki method looks like through a series of stories of communities who have built mini-forests, the supporting science, and past writings and conversations with the late Akira Miyawaki, who developed this method. The book is a journey of knowledge and solutions, and one that will be loved by readers who enjoy biographies, nature journals, or just want to learn about a reliable climate solution. Author Hannah Lewis joined Defender Radio to discuss writing the book, why the Miyawaki method matters, and how people all over the world can help kickstart the mini-forest revolution. To start out talking about the book, Mini-Forest Revolution, and the Miyawaki method, which I hope I'm getting close to accurate, I was wondering, I guess maybe, how did you first come across this? I mean, the book itself tells the story of the questions I want to ask you, which is what makes it a wonderful read. As you learn also about the Miyawaki method, but I'd love if you could share just sort of the brief, how did you end up sort of being from Minneapolis and then learning about this Japanese agricultural or ecology solution?
While in France.
While in France, by the way, that like paragraph is the best pitch for ever moving to France that I have ever read in my life.
The Pirates does it all, doesn't it?
Yes, right? A former pirate cove? Yes, please.
Yeah. When I moved to France, my partner is French. That's why we moved there. I started working for an organization based in the US, in Cambridge, called Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. And I had wanted to get involved in something climate action related. And I really liked the nature-based solutions approach. And so my job there is to read and write about the importance of ecosystems for healthy, expansive ecosystems for regulating water cycles and carbon cycles and keeping the land cool. So I really enjoy that work, but it also made me start itching to do something on the land to restore ecosystems. And so I was really primed when just a short article crossed my screen about a Miyawaki project in the city of Nantes, which was not too far from where I was living, a few hours. Mm-hmm. And it was a couple, and they were planting a 200 square meter forest, a native, dense, biodiverse forest, sort of in response to a road expansion near their house. Mm-hmm. And that sounded so cool because it was a couple, along with, friends and local volunteers that were taking this on, and they were planting not just trees, but they were planting an ecosystem. And the idea that the ecosystem would get set in place, and then it would become self-sustaining, and it would be a real forest, a real dense forest, wildlife habitat, and that they could do that, and it was really appealing to me. So I contacted them and learned more about it, and then just promptly proposed it to the school where my kids were attending. And just little by little, the town I found other allies in the town, and we got together and proposed it to the town council. So it eventually got proposed and planted with schools where my kids were attending. So that was sort of half of my discovery of the Miyawaki method, and the other half was then reaching out to the group in Paris that was planting mini forests, and elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in the world, and hearing their stories, why they were doing it, and what kind of difference they thought it was making. And so all of those came together in my book.
And I really enjoyed reading the book because it's, as I kind of noted, you're telling the story of you learning about this and the people you met who knew Akira Miyawaki. And that makes it so much easier to connect to the information. So it's not a textbook of this is what the vegetation you need and this is the exact process. And books like that exist and procedures like that exist. But this is the story of a journey of knowledge, which is the greatest story for me always, of how you learned and what you learned and who taught you these things and why they matter. And it makes it so digestible and really follows a lot of lovely storytelling traditions. And I'm going to be going in and out of both writing questions and actual mini forest questions. So at the beginning, though, what makes the big difference between what many of us have done and you sort of, going out and planting trees, right? But so many of us have seen that around our communities or done that. We went out and planted a tree. What makes this concept different from that? You noted that there's additional things planted.
Yeah, so oftentimes when we see trees planted, we see one kind of medium-sized tree planted on its own in a big hole in the ground. And then, several paces on another tree that looks just the same, is just as big, planted in another big hole. And so those trees are planted just sort of as individuals, just here's a tree. And the difference with the Miyawaki method is that you're not missing the forest for the trees. You're planting trees in relation to one another in the way that they would grow in an ecosystem. So, and you're planting them really densely, 3 plants per square meter or square yard, and not just one kind of tree and not just one size of tree, but you're planting a really wide mix, anywhere from 10 to 30 or 40 species or even more. And you're planting tall canopy trees, smaller trees, and small shrubs. So in that square meter where you're putting 3 plants, you're generally doing 3 plants of different sizes. So you're using the horizontal space on the land, and you're also using the vertical space as they grow up. As they grow up, they'll be occupying different layers of what becomes the forest. And so the denseness there stimulates interactions among the plants, and one of those interactions is that they're competing. They're small at the beginning, and they're competing to use that space and get up to the sun. And they're feeding the soil with carbon compounds, which builds the microorganisms in the soil, which then helps the plants access nutrients and water and improves the soil generally. And then the other thing that's cool is that a forest is a place that has a perimeter, and it has a canopy, and it has an interior space. And when you have a forest, there is a microclimate on the inside, because the direct sunlight is blocked out, the wind is blocked to a certain extent, and and the heat from the outside is limited. So you get cooler, moister interior, and that protects the soil, and it also kind of protects the everything else in there from any extremes that you would have outside the forest.
Yeah, it's impressive how many different elements there are involved, but at the same time how simplistic and lovely it is in concept, because what you're describing on one hand is, again, it's this complex ecosystem Kickstarter. It's almost like getting your starter yeast in a bowl or something. It's the goo that's going to become everything else. And then at the same time, you're using terms that, for me, hearing from an artistic side of, you're using your nice levels, and you're looking at having some diversity across and maybe a nice diagonal line to show. And it's just interesting. And I get that feeling as well from your writing that Akira Miyawaki was not just an ecologist, but had this artistry and philosophy that very much surrounded a lot of his work through his life.
Yeah, he was a really big thinker. I mean, obviously he was a man of action. He planted nearly 3,000 forests
Jeez.
in over a 50-year career. And
Wow.
he planted into his 90s. I mean, or he was active into his 90s. And so he was just really truly engaged in the world. And his vision was not only to restore ecosystems, forest ecosystems, but to teach people about forests and to help people, recognize the ecosystems that they are a part of, that we are a part of, to recognize the main tree species in the forests of our area, to understand that we are part of nature and that we depend on nature and that we owe it to one another to help to restore nature, to restore these ecosystems that sustain us. And yeah, I really grew to admire him.
Yeah.
Probably can tell in the writing. I grew to be very fond of him.
Well, and it's the stories of other people telling their interactions and the way they learned from him. That's, to me, that's sort of a measure of greatness, is the stories that the person, not friends necessarily, not family, but people who just crossed paths with professionally, the warmth with which they speak about that experience and how it changed them is, again, lovely is the word that keeps coming to mind. And as a writer too, I should have a better word than that, but it's a nice warm feeling to read this. And as is often the case in environmental books, there's an expectation of horror at this stage in our existence. And it's hard to sometimes dig into this stuff. And this is as someone whose job it is, as you will experience, to read primarily, to read about all of the things going on. And it weighs on you. So to read books like this, where there are bad things and we're not going to ignore them, but we're going to talk about solutions and really
Yeah.
dive into that. It seems great.
Yeah, and so going back to Miyawaki, I think he said, and he reiterated this a lot. We don't really have the right to give in to tragic outcomes. We don't.
Mhm.
We're here. We're here. We have energy in this world. We have time and a place in this world, and we can give back. And so working together to restore ecosystems is a really meaningful way to give back, not only to the ecosystems and the people living today, but to the future generations that will be here. And I think that really resonated with me because there are things we can do. There really are. They may not be enough. They, but they're but there's something, and on the other hand, they may be what's needed. So
Well, it's a large scale issue that there isn't a single answer to, unfortunately.
exactly,
While
yeah,
many people will profess they have the one, like most things in life, it is a problem that came from multifaceted, complex systems, and it's going to require complex and multifaceted solutions. And
yeah,
one of the ways to talk about this, we'll talk about big and then maybe micro, but you've got an element in here on forest seawalls. And in our emails before this interview, I had mentioned that some of this reminds me of hugelkultur, which I did an episode on in the last season of the show, which is taking small mounds of natural vegetation and debris and whatnot and creating opportunities to plant. And you immediately responded with a study that showed an example of how that was sort of used. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think it's such a cool idea that once I read about it, seemed really, 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 really obvious.
hmm. The idea of planting on mounds per
Mhm.
se.
Well, on mounds as well as the impact of using the placements, I would think. So, not only saying like we need to find ways to build effectively, but then where we can build effectively now allows prevention of certain natural disaster, or at least slows some response from climate
Yeah,
change. So,
yeah.
flooding or severe issues related to air quality and stuff.
Yeah. Well, so what Miyawaki's vision was that there was the major tsunami in Japan, just off the northeast shore, and it was devastating. And so right when that happened, Miyawaki and his colleague Doryu Hyoki, who had built a mini forest at his Buddhist temple a few years prior, they went and looked at the devastation and made a lot of observations and thought about, well, this could happen again, and why don't we take this opportunity to, to restore all of this devastated land with native forests. And so the idea was to plant I think it was like 300 kilometer forest wall. So a forest basically on a mound of land going up the shore, going up the coastline. And so the idea was to take all the rubble, all the debris that had been created by the tsunami, chunks of cement, planks of wood, and anything non-toxic, and put that in the ground to build the mound. They needed to do something with all of that debris. Mm-hmm. And so here was actually a very useful thing to do with it. So build this long sort of alley where you're mounding up the debris, and then you pile topsoil and earth on top of it, and so you get a pretty high mound, and then you plant the forest on top of that. And it was preferable for several reasons. One was just generally it's nice to have a well-drained area for planting a forest like that. You don't want water stagnating anywhere, and that was something that Miyawaki always emphasized, was planting on at least a small mound. But then if so in a tsunami situation, the water would crash over that mound, and then the trees there would hold the land in place with their deep roots and their interconnected deep roots, and their holding the soil like that. And so instead of cars washing and other things washing out to sea, you have the trees there sort of blocking it. And a lot of cars did wash out to sea after the tsunami was receding. So yeah. So it would also slow the tsunami from coming into the inland area, because it was a high wall. So people would have a little more time to evacuate. So in what I learned in interviewing was they did a few of those, but it was really an unfamiliar idea. And so instead, what was put in was in much of that area was a concrete, really, really tall and deeply reinforced concrete wall that went on the coastline to kind of serve a similar effect, but completely different.
Well, one of them creates an ecosystem and the other one kills it. So interesting cross purposes, but interesting to see the idea played out. And again, it makes more sense because concrete, and this, we'll skip back to this, but in talking about reducing heat domes or urban heat islands and all of that kind of stuff, we're trying to get rid of concrete. We're trying to put green on top of concrete because of how much better it is for us and the environment and the ecosystem. So it's an interesting choice to go in the other direction, but time will share a bit with us. And in talking about the scope, in the foreword from Paul Hawken to the book, there is reference to, but I'm going to pull this up so I can read elements of it. Estimated 3,300 billion tons of carbon held in terrestrial ecosystem, 4 times more carbon than is in the atmosphere of CO2 in the form of CO2. If we increase in the next 30 years the amount of carbon held in land by 9%, we will have brought back to Earth all of the carbon dioxide emitted by coal, gas, and oil combustion, deforestation, and extractive agriculture since 1800. And effectively, the argument is that if we were to take, here's the rest of it, skipping ahead a little, 5 billion acres of degraded land on Earth and use 1/5 of it to become mini forests, as described by this method, we could return all of the carbon emitted in the atmosphere from 1800 until now. That is, I can't imagine the size of those numbers. They can't be processed by my brain.
Yeah,
So
I get it.
right, like, so I guess sort of two-part question here is, one, why aren't we doing that right now? And two, on a much more local scale, how do we start implementing? Because I think that's the other thing, is this is one of those ideas that on a massive scale is world saving, but it also can very much be community saving as well, and provide a
Mhm.
lot of resilience and a lot of ecosystem boons. So maybe, we'll go from one extreme to the other of, why aren't we, or are we, or how can we prompt our leaders and organizations to take on that kind of a task of 5 billion acres of degraded land being turned into beneficial ecosystems?
Yeah. Well, yeah, so one thing that's going on is that we have this biodiversity crisis. We have this loss of ecosystems, and ecosystems are made out of carbon. So
Mhm.
it's like the most elegant solution to rebuild biodiversity, rebuild ecosystems with the carbon that is in the atmosphere in excess.
Mhm.
We that carbon's not a bad thing. It's what life is made out of, and
Yep.
so we need it down here on the land to to expand living ecosystems and the biosphere. So that's just a pretty cool concept. And I think the role of mini forests in cities, there's one there's one aspect where what's cool about it is that you can do it at a community scale. You can, one person can say, hey guys, hey school, let's do this with our students and parents and teachers on this land right next to the school. And bingo, it's not such a gigantic, enormous project that needs the UN's involvement or something. So, and at the same time, what you get is you get the connection to nature that the people who are there planting it, caring for it, watching it mature get to experience and learn. um, you get the cooling of the area. So if you have, like, in several places you have schoolyards that are just concrete or asphalt,
Yep.
and the kids go out there on a hot school day, and that's that's sort of exhausting and tiring to play in such a hot environment. And so you get that immediate benefit for the kids, and also if it's in a polluted area, you're cleaning the air. So lots of little benefits like that that are local and immediate. And then when you start thinking bigger picture, you can think about like larger scale ecosystem restoration and protection projects in larger areas. But then through cities, what one thing we need to preserve global biodiversity is connectivity, connectedness between
Mhm.
the ecosystems, so that animals can migrate, so that they can find their way from one ecosystem to another, so that they can mix with other populations genetically. And that's essential for those larger ecosystems. So what we can do in cities is try to create lots of these little mini forests that help animals traverse that human matrix of the city to get from one side to the other into a more rural or natural environment.
Well, and I think it's fascinating too, because we start looking at the variety of options. So a mini forest is an incredible way of doing this. I've also done an interview for this season on green roofs. So creating little ecosystems, and it's arguably similar to what we'll see on a wildlife overpass or the corridors, where we're just making it go from one side to the other effectively in a healthy ecological way, and the benefits of it are just immediate. It's incredible. So one of the things I've read a lot of really interesting stuff, and one of the examples was a project like this starting as a sound barrier, and I thought that was a great idea. And again, growing up in the suburbs of Toronto, um, it's just concrete walls next to the highway. That's what they did
Mhm,
when I was a kid.
mhm,
It's a distinct color and everything. They're still there.
mhm,
Anyone who's ever driven down the QEW knows exactly what I'm talking about. And it's like, okay, well, we're not getting rid of those, but why not line them with green? Why not build forests or mini forests just on the other side of them with little holes to let, like there's so many tools that we can use.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's very interesting. And the way it starts is not always with, I want a mini forest. It's, I want sound protection, or I want reduction from pollution, or I want reduction from heat.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and roadways is a good example because those are sort of inherently connectors. Connectors, and so we can take advantage of the fact that there's already, a linear space there that at least smaller animals can use to move around the landscape if we're planting on roadways. There's so much opportunity there, and also, yeah, the double benefit there of blocking the noise and the pollution from the neighboring
Yeah.
residential areas.
It's also a traffic calming measure, which I think is a great idea as well. And in Hamilton, we've had a lot of problems. This came up in my other interview as well on green roofs. And it just, I got to email city council later, all of the stuff I found out about over these 2 interviews, because I feel like it's a potential solution for that. And they'll ignore me again. But is there a scale at which this has to be done? Because I feel like that's what, whenever we talk about environmental solutions, there's an inherent pulling back of, well, what's this going to cost me? Or how long do I have to, do I have to do my entire yard? Can I do just, 3 square meters in a corner, and will that help? Or do I have to completely re-landscape everything and spend thousands of dollars? How can people get started in this on a very individual scale too?
Well, interestingly, in the Netherlands, where they've got a big project where they work with schools and build, the tennis court size mini forest with schools, and they've done that by the end of this year, I think it'll be 230 schools throughout the country, or maybe more. But people have, this has sort of clicked for lots of people, and so yeah, lots of people have been asking that exact question, and so they developed a model to do sort of a backyard mini forest garden. So they sort of supply kind of a starter kit. I'm not sure what's all in the kit, but the idea is that, yeah, you can do this in your backyard in a garden size environment, and it's even less like a real forest than a tennis court size grove of trees is. But I mean, it's still a huge load, better than that size of lawn, which only has 1 layer of vegetation and not many species perhaps. So, and again, it's a way to learn, because if you're going to do the Miyawaki method, you have to understand the ecosystem that you're living in. What are the types of forests here? Is it what are the major trees in these forests? Are they oaks? Are they beech? Are they in Japan? They had evergreen laurel trees were the main tree in a lot of the forest there. So you have to learn that. Maybe you don't even know what one of those looks like, and so you get to learn what it looks like, to identify it, to learn what sort of species grow with it. So it's I think the lesson in the Netherlands is and their main goal is, the main goal is connecting kids and people generally to nature, and the secondary goal is restoring ecosystems. But the idea is that once you connect people to nature, then that sort of infuses the whole culture and society, and people start paying more attention, and so the second goal is met automatically that way. But so I think the lesson there was like, no, we can do this at a smaller size, and we're still going to get a lot of really positive results.
Yeah. And that's, I think, a great thing people can do is, again, in my research for this, found out that by 2 days, I missed the deadline. The city of Hamilton gives out native tree species and will drop them off planted on your yard it's like a week-long thing every year. And these are native species to this area that we need more of to improve our canopy. If you want one, sign up. And if it's appropriate, we'll drop one into a hole on your yard. And while it's not a whole ecosystem, it's a great start, and you don't have to dig the hole. So I feel like it's kind of win-win that way.
Yeah.
And on that note, and I'm trying to find the term, and I cannot because I'm super professional, talking about the types of vegetation. There's a specific term for it, looking at what kind of vegetation could be there if humans weren't, and the
Oh,
need
right.
to identify those.
Yeah. So that's the idea of potential natural vegetation.
There it
And it's
is.
exactly what you said. If, in any given site in your backyard, if the city had never grown up and the house built and the yard planted in lawn, whatever, what would be growing there? What would be growing there now, according to the current climate conditions, according to the soil, according to the topography. And so that is kind of like the research that you get into when you're doing the Miyawaki method, is trying to figure out what that is. And it's not necessarily obvious given how transformed our cities are.
Hmm.
And so what Miyawaki suggests, and what all the groups that I talk to have done, is they've built a team. So they've connected with universities, botanical societies, local ecologists to figure that out. And so that's a really important part, is you can't necessarily just wing it, because the method is it's a very specific method that trying to figure out what the natural potential natural vegetation is a scientific question. It's
Yeah.
So it involves really thinking it through and figuring it out with lists of what the native species are, but then understanding what your site conditions are, and what species would be growing under those particular conditions.
Yeah, and it's a great point to really reach out locally or find experts. And I think there's always naturalist clubs or nearby universities, or someone. If there's a creek, just follow the creek, and eventually you'll find someone in waders doing research. It feels like a rule in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And to find out what you would want, because for me, like, I love birch trees. I think they are beautiful. I love the group of 7 paintings of birch trees. I want birch bark everywhere. And for me, if I could plant a tree in the yard right now, it would be a birch. And it's fascinating then to see that notification from the city saying, we want you to plant trees, and these are the ones that would be beneficial. And it's dogwood and saffrus and kind of medium height trees with lots of early buds. And I don't know, I haven't looked into it at all. I would presume those are also very much the native species of the area and what's necessary to help with that connectivity.
Yeah. Well, and so here's another thing about the Miyawaki method, is that when you're saying potential natural vegetation, and that potential natural vegetation is a forest, is a hardwood forest, then those species are climax shade tolerant species. And so a lot of trees are not shade tolerant. They like to grow in open areas where there's lots of sun.
Yeah.
And they don't have to fight for sunlight. So yeah, so if you were going to plant something in an open area, like one in the middle of the lawn, you could plant a climax species, or you could plant a more of a pioneer species, and both would do well. But in a Miyawaki forest, you're trying to create the climax forest that's going to kind of self-replicate. And so you want to plant those shade tolerant climax species from the beginning, and then they'll be the only ones that can then germinate and grow in that shade that you've created. So it'll be kind of this stable, more or less stable community.
Yeah, we've got rows of Sharon and dogwood in the yard, and those are 2 examples of. I don't know if they're classified as trees or bushes. I am terrible at my classifications and all of that because I'm not a scientist and cannot memorize things. But they are both trees. You know, they are not too tall, but create a lot of shade. And after a storm, you can go out and see it looks like a mini forest, ironically, under the rows of Sharon, because all of the little twigs start poking up and they look like tiny little trees coming up because they just propagate so rapidly. And I had to go to war with dogwood under the deck this year. But yeah, so they're interesting choices.
Yeah.
I'd like to wrap with a quote you included from Miyawaki and sort of ask what your impressions of it are, and if it's maybe sort of a general message you want, because it's one of these quotes that for me jumped off the page and is going to stay with me. And to read it, it is, "Nothing is greater than living," he said in a 2012 interview at the age of 84. "Then what is the reason for living? It is to do something anyone can do anywhere for our tomorrow. I want everyone to do what they can do. I will plant trees for the next 30 years, for myself, my loved ones, for Japan, for the future of the 7 billion people living on this planet. Let's plant trees together." And for me, that's a very chills on my arms. This is an impressive individual who has done impressive things. Do you get that response from it? And do you think that is sort of the theme of the book that you set out to write? That this is not about doom and despair, but about hope and about what we can all do to make tomorrow better.
Yeah. I agree with you. I feel like there's that quote, and there's a few others of his that no matter how many times I read them or hear them, I still almost get a little choked up, because it's such a beautiful big vision. I mean, he like we were talking about earlier, he says it's irresponsible to just be in despair. It's we owe it to each other to try to do what we can, and then this is just it's such a meaningful thing to do, because it brings people together, and it brings people together with nature, and there's so much hope, and there's so much promise, and there's so much health in that.
To learn more about Hannah Lewis and her work, check out hannahlewis.org. You can find Mini Forest Revolution through chelseagreen.com, Chapters Indigo, Amazon, or your local bookseller. Links are available in the show notes and at defenderradio.com. I want to thank Hannah for her time. I was fascinated by the subject matter of this book, and I really believe that Hannah has shared a story that can help transform the modern world in positive ways. I encourage you to read it. And of course, thanks to you for listening. If you want to help more people find Defender Radio and The Switch, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or just sharing your favorite episode on social media. It really helps get more people listening and working together on solutions for wildlife and the planet. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers. Thank you for listening.